Sheetal, it's very great for you to join us here in the Cypher Brief virtual studio. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me and asking me.
We love talking with you and look forward to doing a lot more of it in the future. It's such a crazy time, obviously, in the
Right.
world. Both. I mean, every morning we wake up and there's headlines that you just simply couldn't have imagined a couple of years ago. Um, I want to I want to draw your attention back to the headlines around Operation Spider's Web or Spider Web, however we're talking about it, and the spectacular sort of drone assault that Ukraine was able to launch against Russia. We're looking at that topic here at the Cypher Brief.
Okay.
Um, First of all, what was your reaction then and now in terms of the impact that that operation had, both to Russia, but then broadly speaking, what that means for, potential threats for other countries, including America? What was your takeaway from that?
So I would say, when I first saw that operation, even before that, just the way the Ukrainians have adopted the use of drones to give themselves a little bit of a tactical advantage and how they evolve. They evolve not only their military strategy, but they keep evolving in their use of drones, building of drones, shifting manufacturing, right? I mean, wooden drones, who would have thought? And so when they went and launched that operation, my first thought was, holy shit, you could do this in the United States pretty easily. And if you had independent drones that, if you had developed a GPS that didn't require GPS or fiber optic drones, and then you had them all pre-positioned, you'd be ready to go, and we would have a very hard time mitigating that. So that was my thought. It was not a very happy thought. It was more of a, oh my God, this has serious implications for homeland safety, but also for like Guam, Hawaii, Alaska.
And it was both, in terms of the intelligence, it was both a success for the Ukrainians to be able
Hmm.
to plan, organize, and execute that operation so deep inside of Russia, and also a massive failure on the part of the Russian service for not detecting and allowing that to happen.
Right.
Both elements of that, equation are in play here in America, obviously. Are we, just maybe from a big picture standpoint, are we are we resourced to be able to think like that and prevent something like that from happening in America? So, so far after 9/11, we had such a
Yeah.
resounding decade or two of successes on the counterterrorism front, but it's been a while since we've really faced anything of that magnitude. How confident are you that we're resourced effectively to kind of prevent something like that, just from a CI standpoint here in America?
From a CI standpoint, I don't think we are resourced. I think the best way to do something like this, like if we were really had a concerted effort, and there's a lot of people thinking about this. DoD has task forces set up, the private sector is working on it. But I think from a resource standpoint, the number of targets is tremendous, right? You're talking everything from critical infrastructure, ports, if you're talking terrorism, you're talking stadiums, things that are not hardened. And so to do it would require a real, I don't know, layered approach where you have to bring in like local authorities. You have to iron out who's responsible for what. I mean, currently the FAA has responsibility for the skies, right? But they're really focused on passenger aircraft, and I would prefer that they stay focused on passenger aircraft and what's going on in the skies, as well as like enemy adversarial aircraft. But who has that responsibility in that small drone range is still up in the air, right? DoD has it for their bases, but who has it for the rest of the areas and who can actually mitigate? I think the identification's hard. I think we can detect. Might not be able to tell the difference between a bird and a drone, and then the speed of how you mitigate it. So I think it's a huge resource issue, but also like one that requires policy, law, roles and responsibilities. You can't just some of the technology that's there to take down a drone. and I'm talking like the smaller classes of drones, not the big ones, right? DoD should really pay attention to the bigger ones, but like the smaller ones, can you really use an RF jammer or a GPS jammer? Are you going to inadvertently take down something else? So that I think slows down any kind of response too. And I don't think we've ironed this out. I know we had not a year and a half ago. I don't think we've made
Well, I
this
mean, a year
far.
and a half ago, if I remember, is about the time that we were seeing a lot of those headlines,
Yeah.
mostly resulting from what was characterized as unknown drone,
Mm-hmm.
sightings or operations in the northeast of our country.
Right.
Um, Talking about those conversations that have to happen in the authorities, is it your sense that those conversations are not happening at the level they need to? I mean, with what you just laid out in terms of the small drones to the large drones, if you just simply look at what's happening in Ukraine in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
different methods that they're using to counter drones, it's everything from electronic warfare down to small arms
Right.
fire, which we're obviously quite limited in our ability to be able to do that in America. Does this quickly become like a counter-terrorist mission that, okay, the FBI is in charge of? Or like, what are your thoughts? Have you heard anything that would tell you that we're thinking about going in new directions in terms of the authorities and how it's going to play out in America?
I mean, if I remember from when I was in government, the agencies that have the authority are Department of Justice, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Energy. But then what do you do when you overlap in areas of responsibility, right? Who is going to pick that up? So I think those are the questions that they're working on, but what hasn't been ironed out, and I think police departments are doing it. One of my friends was telling me that Boston Police Department has drone on drone, but really, can they launch it? And I do think everybody understands the complexity of this problem. I'm just not sure it is like the highest priority at the moment. We tend to do things more reactively, like
Right,
something has to happen
right,
before we do it. And it's going to be tough, right? So are you going to give Michigan police the ability to throw a net over, or are they going to be allowed to take it down, and then how would they be allowed to take it down, and at what altitude, and where's FAA going to say, okay, you can do this, we're not worried about commercial aircraft, and how can you do this in, like, let's say 5 minutes?
right. Which is often not the strength of these highly complex
Right.
interagency type organizations, is the ability to move at that speed, obviously.
I mean, I was just thinking, like, okay, let's say you launch a swarm of drones, right? And they're all on fiber optics. And then you see something flying. Well, then it takes a while to figure out what is it. And then is it an authorized drone or is it an unauthorized drone? And by the time you figure all this out, the swarm's probably done what it wanted to do and left. It is not as simple as, like, hey, we need NORAD to track for ballistic missiles incoming. And
Right.
NORAD can't do this.
No, it's very, I mean, the problem is so vexing. I think just when you look at, again, the lessons that we're learning on a daily basis and watching from Ukraine, which is a war zone,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
you see the ability of, Russia in this case as Ukraine's combatant enemy to launch drone attacks that span the front lines where there's trenches all the way
Mm-hmm.
into, urban areas where kids going to school are under threat from drones. And that
Right.
dynamic is in play here in America like no other. And that's, I think, the part that's really, well, that's why the cipher brief is looking at this issue. Obviously, it's not an easy one. I want to shift a
No.
little bit though,
Mm-hmm.
and you just laid out some elements of this conversation that are important. And when you talk about the technology that's in play here, both from the development of drones and how we're using them, and also from the development of counter UAS technologies, the private sector plays an incredible role. This technology is moving so fast. From your former role in government, I know you worked with and thought a lot about private sector engagement. How are you thinking about that in terms of some of these potential threats? Is the government going to be able to keep up with the pace of technology? How critical is the private sector, in protecting the
Right.
homeland now, whether we're talking about UAS?
I think there is a recognition. I think the Defense Innovation Unit has been reaching out to the private sector because even if you look at the drone technology, right, some of the most effective drones early on in the conflict in Russia Ukraine are obsolete because the air defense has caught up. And so you have to keep evolving that technology. And government is not going to move at that pace of innovation. So it is going to be the private sector. And you have both, private sector working on newer, smaller, agile drones, but you also have this similar companies coming up with new counter UAS technology and strategy. It's going to be a little bit like cyber, right? There's never going to be a counter UAS technology that is it. And then once we get it, we're going to be done. I think it's going to be constantly evolving, constantly mitigating that threat. And so, from a counterintelligence perspective, it's going to be we're going to have to stay a little ahead of where that technology is going, but also just keep evolving on both sides.
Is I know you're not in government anymore, but you just recently retired. Can you talk a little bit about what you observed throughout your career in government in terms of the mindset of being able to keep pace with technology, and sort of on the private sector side, you've got this very like risk forward,
Right.
investment fueled sort of mindset for developing things that doesn't always align with the way that, government and certainly in intelligence processes or aligns their resources against the mission sets that they have. And where these two meet in this public private sector debate, there still can be tension in terms of the culture of both sides, but it's gotten a lot better than it
Yeah.
had certainly years and years ago. Can you talk to me just a little bit about that from your perspective, and where do you think we are today, and then where do you predict that it's going in the near term?
I think we've always been really good at being at the cutting edge of technology government wide when it comes to smaller operational issues, right? Whether you're talking special forces, intelligence operations, whatever it is. We are a little slower and far more bureaucratic when it comes to large scale adoption enterprise functions. So I think the working with the private sector is getting better. It's always been there, but I think in some cases having the private sector drive some of that is still not culturally accepted in some cases. And then even if you do get it, right? Because you're going to get people who really lean in on risk in government. Then you're going to have people like me who work in counterintelligence or security officers that are going, "What are you doing? How do you want to
Right.
do this?" Right? So having that set of people, the ones who do the risk management, also be really up to speed on technology and where it's going and figure out how to mitigate against it is going to be needed. And I think that is a slower evolution, right? You never get the defenders to be very like risk taking in some sense.
Speaking of counterintelligence, where that sort of comes together with technology is a fascinating topic, I think, in 2025, especially in America. There is always a debate about the private sector. Just look at the topic of NVIDIA and chips in China, and how that has, how that issue has complicated the discussion around U.S. China involvement, China's being involvement in advanced technology, where that aligns with counterintelligence is really complicated in today's world. Do we need to do more to educate America, sort of broadly speaking, but then tech leaders and CEOs about the counterintelligence risks that they're just not inherently equipped to handle as private sector leaders who are thinking about their boards or their investors or their products or their sales? These folks don't wake up every day thinking about counterintelligence, but yet that's a threat vector that is becoming even more critical, for America's
Absolutely.
adversaries. How do we get
You
there?
are
What do we do?
speaking my language. So I
Yeah.
was just having a conversation with a couple of colleagues, And one of the things that I have been struck by is, and now that I am not in government, I have a little bit more leeway to have these conversations, which is in the private sector, just explaining. Everybody thinks I am not a threat. I mean, I'm not at risk. Like, why would a foreign adversary be interested in me? And just kind of laying out just the whole landscape of how we'll do China, right? But it's any adversary, how China approaches espionage, right? It's a whole of country effort. It is, we're going to do it via IP theft, cyber, right? Insiders, everything and anything that they can use to do it. New espionage laws. And then we, on our side, have a private sector that's incredibly robust, incredibly innovative, and I think sometimes slightly naive. Because there is the pressure of I need the bottom line. And then well, I just make this widget. Why would it be important? And then when you kind of tell them, it's still not an integrated approach, right? It's not you don't have the security, the HR, and everybody sitting when big decisions are made in companies. And that's their own internal, right? You got to have something that looks at counterintelligence, not just physical security or cybersecurity, just has a more holistic approach because I think it just gets left out, right? It's like, I've secured my networks. I think I'm fine. And then you look at the amount of insiders, and we're not talking malicious insiders, right? Just insiders clicking the wrong key, not doing something correctly, and you lose a lot of IP. And that actually hurts the revenue. And so I don't think that companies need to stop doing business with China. I think there just needs to be a risk calculus on what are we risking? Is it worth the risk? And what do we want to protect?
Who's the right person? Who's the right entity? Who's the right authority to increase the counterintelligence level of awareness and education in America? Does that inherently come from government, which would create, some probably some issues on the private sector side, or is that through people like you that are not in government anymore? Like, where does that come? Like, where, how do we get to a better place?
There's a lot of us who are not in government who really want to help the private sector in this space. And there's a lot of people who have set up their businesses. But ultimately, it is the responsibility. Like, if you really look at who should be doing it, because the ones who have all the information on the threats are in government. So you had DISA, I think DNI has National Counterintelligence and Security Center. They had a robust program to get things out to the public on their website. And then we did briefings. Their FBI actually has the mandate if there's a threat to a company or a risk. They're the ones who generally take the lead because of the law enforcement side.
Right,
But yeah, it depends on how you come in too, right? How the private sector company is going to accept what you say.
right,
But it is one. I think just because all the global strategic competition is going on in the private sector, and that includes everything, right? Drones, chips, AI, biotech. You have to raise everybody's like level of awareness on it.
yeah. Well, we started this conversation off talking about drones in Ukraine and counter UAS, and we've certainly touched on a number of super interesting topics. I know that the Cypher Brief readers and our audience listens to and thinks about deeply. What haven't I asked you that is top of mind, or that you're focused on, or that you're worried about in this? I mean, just today, this it's an incredibly consequential week here in America with what's happening at the White House today, but just what's top of mind for you that I haven't touched on?
I think some of the things, I mean, you got at what has been one of my main focuses in the last couple of weeks, which is the how do you put together something for private sector on threats and building like a robust, you can call it insider trust system or insider threat. I think the other one I've been looking at is just because that was my area of focus in the past, this 50% tariff on the Indian government
Hmm.
and Indian goods.
Which is the
Ta-
highest, I believe, highest tariff on any non-US nation currently. It's the highest rate, I think.
I I believe so.
Right.
And policy aside, we just spent as a nation over a decade convincing the Indians that they needed to work closer with us to counter the Chinese. And because we're two big democracies, they're a very large economy, and that we should really work together.
Right.
And I'm a little concerned because the Indians are a little bit like the French of South Asia, right? The Indians are the French of South Asia because they have been non aligned. They are wary about U.S. lasting power. They're wary that we will go align with Pakistan. And now, just reading all the commentary coming out of the Indian newspapers, it's kind of like we shot ourselves in the foot on the bilateral relationship. And I'm not quite sure why.
And that's also against the backdrop of, putting pressure on companies like Apple to move manufacturing out of
Yes,
China, which
they
India
moved
is a
they
prime,
moved it
and
to
also
India.
and
Yeah,
also convincing India still not to invest all of
right.
their resources in the Russian defense, equipment. So there's a lot of complicated sort of, broader national issues at play here that you're mentioning.
Yeah, and it's just I just don't understand because in the long run, it's going to be harder to get them back, or at least they'll keep sitting on the fence, which is what they did for about 50 years.
Right.
And now they're cozying up to China too. So it's kind of like it is weird. It's weird.
And they have, not, I mean, they're a large country. They have a very sophisticated military, a very sophisticated
Yep.
intelligence service. They're a major player in the tech space. So that's certainly one that, we're paying attention to here at the Cypher Brief as well. And perhaps we'll come back to you on a future conversation and dig in a little bit more on some regional issues like that. I think that would be really interesting for our readers. Sheetal, thank you so much for joining
You're
us today
welcome.
in the Cypher Reef Virtual Studio. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Same. Take care, Brad.